A nautical day on the pirate ship. A nautical day on the pirate ship. Oh, won't you be mine? Oh, couldn't you be mine? Oh, won't you be my matey? Ahoy, matey! I'm just dropping everything right now. Don't mind me. Oh, you can't see this. This is backwards in this. It says I'm going to start reading in 5 minutes. The good news is if you hold your video up to a mirror, you can read this carefully. Now, I'm just going to set this down here right now. So, hopefully everybody has their literary juice. I have mine. All right. So we're going to get started right away. Now, Captain Justin Kase, that is I. I'm going to be reading Blackbeard's Ghost, Part 2. Yes, Part 2 by Ben Stahl today. Now, I did some work out on the ship and everything, so my eyes are really dry. I can't see very well. So every once in a while, a pirate needs some help with his vision. So I'm going to do that by putting on some spectacles made for me by a good friend of mine, Benjamin Franklin. Yes, I knew him. He's a good drinking buddy. All right. So he luckily made me a pair that goes really well with my color scheme and everything. So we are going to read today, like I said, Blackbeard's Ghost by Ben Stahl. All right, so Part 2. Now, there are 2 previous videos to this one. Hopefully you've watched them. If you're not, I'm going to give you a quick recap. I'm sorry there's no skip recap button right now. So we read the prologue a week ago Sunday. All right. So in the prologue, we learned about Blackbeard. All right. We learned how he created his tavern, the Boar's Head Tavern. And we met the Witch of Godolphin. All right. So we met her and we found out what happened and how he ultimately met his end and how the witch met her end. And then in Part 1, where we read last Wednesday, we got introduced to our 2 heroes of the story, as it were, JD and Hank. So JD and Hank are 2 young lads from Godolphin and everything. And they like the Boar's Head Tavern. And they know it's rich in history. They don't want it seen torn down by the gentleman who wants to tear it down and put up a gas station of all places. We see lots of things happening like that right now. But, so while they're looking through the Boar's Head Tavern, they come across Blackbeard's dungeon. All right, and down in the dungeon, they actually found a spell written by the Witch of Godolphin, Alditha Stowcroft. So they've decided that they are going to actually take this spell, all right, that Alditha wrote, and they're going to have a seance, all right, and scare some kids. And that's what we're going to read about in Part 2 today, all right? We're going to see what happens with the seance. Because, you know, in every story and movie, doing a seance, reading from books with weird languages that you don't understand, always ends well, all right? So remember that, kids. If you find an old ancient text that you don't understand what it says, just read it out loud on a stormy night, because that always works out perfectly. All right, so here we go. Part 2, that was the recap. So now you know, now we've caught up. So we're going to do Part 2 Sunday. Here we go. The boys worked furiously all day Saturday, setting up the equipment needed for the performance on Sunday afternoon. In the excitement of starting something new, even Hank had become inspired and, forgetting his fears, had thrown himself into the plan with enthusiasm. Now all was in readiness. The news of the seance and the fact that ghosts were involved had spread like wildfire. There was an overwhelming demand for seats, but the boys decided it would be wiser to limit this first venture into the spirit world to a few of the more, impressionable younger children. Shows for their contemporaries could be staged at a later date, at increased rates, of course. JD's costume was intended to be sort of a Hindu affair. As a matter of fact, it was the same costume he wore when he conducted his magic shows. He had no idea what kind of a costume a medium wore, but this one seemed perfect for the role. A man's brightly colored silk dressing gown was the most effective part of the outfit, a gift from Mr. Jones' mother-in-law 2 Christmases back, which Mr. Jones refused to wear. Wear the thing, he had exclaimed. What if someone saw me? And of course, Mrs. Jones could scarcely give it away. A bath towel wound around JD's head to make the perfect turban, especially when surmounted by a large pink ostrich plume he had discovered at the bottom of a trunk. Around his waist was an emerald green sash, and the burnt cork mustache and goatee completed the flamboyant ensemble. I like this kid's color scheme, all right? He has a flair for the dramatics. JD was quite pleased with himself. He and Hank had partitioned off a small area of the cellar by hanging worn-out blankets and a tarpaulin from the overhead beam. This provided a dark and gloomy room, a perfect setting for a seance. The curtains parted and Hank stepped out dressed as Blackbeard. His costume was equally as impressive as JD's. Somewhere the boys had found a gigantic black beard with curved wires that went over the ears. It was a remarkable imitation of the real thing, although it did have a disturbing habit of slipping off when least expected. Hank wore a heavy black overcoat cut off at mid-thigh and a mangy looking as the beard. His Boy Scout shorts and his father's old hat, the brim pinned as a tricorn, completed the picture. Around his waist he wore one of his sister's best belts, and a wide leather affair with a big silver buckle. "Criminy," he told JD. "If she ever knew I had this." And into the belt was shoved a big plastic pistol. "You look great," JD grinned. He was looking at the draperies with satisfaction. He turned to Hank. "Where'd you put the flower? Those kids will be here any minute." "Can't we just skip that part?" "Are you kidding?" JD parted the draperies and ducked inside with Hank at his heels. "Come on, where'd you put it?" Hank expelled a long breath of resignation. Holding his beard in place, he reached under a round table which occupied the center of the area, and came up with a flour sifter, which he handed to JD. A kerosene lantern hung from the ceiling, casting a dismal light over the enclosure, and around the table were arranged a few boxes and chairs. JD cranked the flour sifter, spreading a film of flour over the table. In the light of the lantern it looked just as yellow as sulfur. "Remember," he said officiously, "to come in when I say Om, Om, Om." He paused, wrinkled his brow, pulled out the scroll and studied it. Mananam verbum. He looked at Hank, who was again adjusting the precarious hold of his beard on his batwing ears. "And try to cut down on the noise when you crawl in and move the table." He studied the beard. "And why don't you get some adhesive tape for those whiskers so they stay on?" JD put the sifter on the floor and covered it with the bottom of the drapery. "Now don't forget to snap on the flashlight. You got the flashlight?" "Sure, I got the flashlight. It's in my pocket." The parchment looked even more yellow and ancient in the depressing light. JD's lip moved silently as he rehearsed his magic words. Hank sank into one of the chairs and watched him apprehensively. Old fears were creeping back. "I still don't like this business," he said. "My dad was telling me about a polter something or other. It haunted his grandmother's house." JD looked abruptly. "A what?" A poltergeist." "A poltergeist? What the heck is a poltergeist?" "Well, it's some kind of ghost. The kind that goes around pushing things over. Well, anyhow, this one did." JD observed his friend with mingled interest and disdain. He slowly rolled up the parchment and put it into his pocket. "You mean," he said, "it was a real ghost?" He sniffed. "You're kidding." "Oh yeah," Hank exclaimed as he removed his beard. "The heck I am." His grandma had this big bed, and on top of each of the 4 posts was a brass ball. And when no one slept there, every morning they'd find the balls on the pillow. But when anyone slept in the room, nothing happened." JD stared at him and snorted. "I don't believe it." Hank stood up. "Okay, go ask my dad. He'll tell you. All kinds of funny things happened in that house. Caught fire 3 times. "Yeah? Then what?" "Well, no one would buy it, so they tore it down." "What kind of ghost did your father say it was?" "A poltergeist." The great Hindu Swami's hand moved slowly to his pocket and withdrew the scroll. He was examining it with newborn concern when it came to a pounding on the cellar door and shrill cries of, "JD! Hank!" His concentration was interrupted and the opportunity lost forever to question the advisability of going on with the seance. Poltergeists were forgotten. He shoved the scroll back into his pocket and whispered loudly, "Get out of sight, Hank. I'll let them in." Hank scurried around behind draperies, hooking the wires of his beard over his ears while JD marched regally towards the cellar door and swung it wide. 2 boys and 4 girls, all younger than JD, poured and jabbering and squealing into the basement and crowded around him. "You gonna tell us ghost stories, JD? Hey, where's Hank?" The youngest, Judy, was going on 6 with big blue eyes, proclaimed, "My mommy said you better not scare me." She clung fearfully to the hand of an older girl named Joyce. JD eyed Judy with considerable distaste. "Holy cow, Joyce," he grumbled. "Why'd you have to bring her along for?" "I had to," said Joyce. "I'm babysitting." "Well, if she starts bawling, you take her right home. This isn't kid stuff." He turned away and walked towards the draped area. The group, chattering noisily, flocked after him. At the sight of the dismal drapes, all of them were crestfallen. They had expected something far more spectacular than this, and they wailed their disapproval. "Aw, JD, ain't you going to have a stage?" "Yeah, what happened to the stage you fixed up? Don't you need a stage like that you had for your magic shows?" "Yeah, JD, what's all this junk hanging for? JD!" JD didn't say a word. He held the draperies aside and the battling ceased. They filed inside. Their voices became hushed whispers of oohs and ahs and small giggles. JD carefully closed the draperies behind him, and when he spoke, his voice had the funeral tones of a pompous undertaker. "Take your place around the table, please." He bowed and went to the high-backed carved chair, vintage Sears Roebuck's 1920, and sat rigidly. He closed his eyes as in deep thought. It was like being in a tent, a square tent whose high walls were a hodgepodge of loosely hung, faded blankets and stained dirty canvas. As the children sat around the table, the area behind and beneath them was solid with shadow. Like a bowl half filled with black ink, and the walls soaked it up like a blotter. In a weak yellow light, the tabletop seemed to be floating and bobbing in the gloomy space. "Isn't it spooky, Joyce?" said one of the girls. An older boy, one whom JD and Hank usually referred to as that wise guy, began to intone, "Mary, I'm on the first step. Mary, I'm on." Amid shrieks of laughter, JD leaped to his feet. "Okay, you kids, shut up if you want to see the seance. I won't do it if anyone does any more talking." He glared venomously at the group seated around the table. "I mean it now," he warned. "What's this yellow stuff?" asked Judy innocently, as her hand darted forward and smeared through the flour. JD howled, "Don't touch that, it's magic dust!" Judy jerked her hand away and her eyes widened as she stared apprehensively at the yellow dust on her palm. There was a moment of a concentrated silence as 6 heads bent over the strange powder. JD found the sifter and repaired the damage. "What is that stuff, JD?" one of the boys repeated. JD put the sifter away. "I told you, it's magic dust. And cut the talking." He waited till there was absolute silence, and then he cleared his throat, closed his eyes, and announced that he was about to go into a trance and bring back the ghost of Blackbeard the pirate. "Oh, Blackbeard," he wailed. "Can you hear me?" "Where's Hank?" asked Judy. "Isn't he going to be here too? He said he was." The medium's eyes blinked open. He glowered at Judy, who continued to look at him with innocent and wondering eyes. "Shh," said the older girl. "Hank will be in it. Just wait." JD again closed his eyes. "Oh, Blackbeard," he moaned. "Can you hear me calling you?" He stretched his arms upward, his face twisted, as if he were suffering an endurable agony, and he groaned and wailed amid half-smoldered giggles from his audience. Captain Edward, teach, hear me. I, the great Swami, call to you. Blackbeard! And the giggles became shrieks of laughter. The Swami was angry. Okay, you kids, cut the comedy or I'll quit right now. Oh, come on, JD, said Joyce. We'll be quiet. I want to go home, whined Judy. You all promise? The response was encouraging and JD rose to his feet. Oh, come to us, spirit of Captain Teach. Oh, come to us, ghost of Blackbeard, the greatest pirate that ever lived. He paused with his eyes closed and acted as though he were listening. Then he said, Yes, master, I shall obey. I shall draw the magic lines of Satan in the magic dust. JD opened his eyes and with his fingers traced the Kabbalistic symbols in the flower. For the first time, he attracted an eager and attentive audience. Om, 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 he called loudly, and the draperies opposite him moved slightly. Medenem verbum fohat. The table began to rock, and the children screamed with delight, not one of them aware of Hank's lanky figure sneaking slowly upward from the inky blackness behind them. O Kali Yug, Om, 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 JD groaned. Are you with us? Are you with us, O Captain Teach? Yes, yes, now I feel your presence. Concealed within the voluminous folds of his coat, Hank had a flashlight ready to shine upward on his face. He snapped it on just as the beard slipped. JD waited until things were under control, then raised his arm stiffly and pointed a rigid finger at Hank. The imitation specter's eyes were wide with horror. Welcome, Blackbeard, welcome, said JD. All eyes followed in the direction of the pointing finger, and there were cries of surprise and pleasure, and Judy screamed, Mama! Mama! The flashlight fell clattering to the concrete floor, rolled and clicked against a chair's leg. The beard came loose, but Hank ignored it. His face turned a sickly green. He stood rigidly, his eyes googling at something behind JD. In the air was the acrid smell of burning gunpowder. Hank pointed a shaking hand at the area above JD's head, and from his lips came a hoarse whisper. Behind you, JD! There was no laughter now, only puzzled frowns. Well, JD was annoyed and mystified. Leave it to Hank to louse things up. He turned back to his friend, whose palsied arm was still outstretched. Hank's eyes were closed, and he swayed like a pine tree ready to topple. What's up, Hank? Is this a gag? JD rasped. But Hank was out on his feet. Stiff as a ramrod, his shoulders went back against the draperies, and slowly and majestically he slid to the floor. I want to go home, Judy howled. JD scrambled from his seat and knelt beside his friend. Holy cow, Hank fainted. He stared back from Hank to the space behind the Sears Roebuck chair, then whirled towards the children. I don't see anything. Do you see anything? They gaped at him and shook their heads. Judy started to cry and buried her head in Joyce's lap. Behind the chair loomed the ghost of Captain Edward Blackbeard Teach. His features were wreathed in smoke from the fuses in his beard. Wet strands of seaweed hung from his shoulder. As JD turned back to Hank, the monster grinned and winked. So there we have a picture of the seance. So you can see there's Captain Teach behind the Sears Roebuck chair and the Swami right in front of it. It was the magic hour just after sundown. The bright spring sky had faded into the hazy tints of topaz, and the street lamps glowed over ambitious fireflies, casting light nowhere. The tall trees encircled Godolphin's old courthouse were green-black shadows, and the statue of Robert Maynard, with the cowering pirates at his feet, was an ugly silhouette. From Pamlico Sound came the hoot of a tramp steamer, slogging its way towards Ocracoke Inlet and the sea. The delicious smell of fresh popped corn issuing from the portable stand parked at the curb had made eager customers of JD and Hank. Mechanically, the vendor filled their order. "Put a lot of butter on it," commanded JD. Each boy put his share of the cost upon the counter. They had discovered you didn't get as much if you bought two 15-cent boxes. So it was one very large package the vendor handed to Hank. Carrying the box, the boys drifted off to a park bench some distance away and sat down. Hank held the box in front of JD, who dug deep, getting a large handful.
"I wasn't kidding, JD. You looked right at him. He was standing right behind you, big as life. Don't tell me I was seeing things."
He chewed vigorously.
"I warned you it might work."
JD nonchalantly flipped some corn into his mouth. "Well, none of the other kids saw him. You just thought you saw something." He reached for more, but a big, dirty, hairy hand beat him to it. The monstrous paw projected from the cup, decorated with a row of brass buttons. Astounded, the boys stared at the digging hand, followed it up with their eyes as it withdrew, and carried the popcorn to the bearded face. Captain Edward Teach, ex-skipper of the Queen's Anne's Revenge, leaned back on the bench and lazily tossed the popcorn into his mouth. His enormous beard was bedecked with the multitude of tiny ribbons and the remains of burnt-out cannon fuses. 2 long braids of coal-black hair hung from his ears to his shoulders, while the rest was a tangly and oily filth. A few strands of seaweed still clung to his coat. Incongruously, his tricorn hat bore aloft JD's pinked ostrich plume pinned to its side. He chewed noisily and with gusto. His belch resounded as loudly as the recent hoot of a steamer. He pushed his hat back on his head and reached for more popcorn. Hank held the box in a paralyzed clutch, or if he would surely have dropped it. The pirate jiggled the popcorn in his hand, studied it carefully before popping it into his mouth, chewed and swallowed, making sucking noises through his back teeth, and picked at them with a thumbnail. Without removing his thumb, he announced with authority, "Ah, ain't near as good what the Injuns make," and brushed the crumbs from his beard and his coat. Well, this article was the only clean and neat thing about him. I mean, it blazed with a row of brass buttons. And with it he wore greasy pantaloons, and his legs were encased in large boots. A policeman passing on his beat smiled at the boy. "Hi," he said pleasantly. "Nice evening, isn't it?" And continued up the street. Well, Hank sat rigid, staring straight ahead, and JD gawked after the policeman in astonishment. Holy cow, he thought wildly. He can't see him. He looked at Hank, whose only movement was his Adam's apple rising and falling with every single gulp. "Yep," said Teach. "Parched maize be the stuff to raise a swab's thirst, I always say." He grinned at the boys. "Yes, sirree, lads, a mighty thirst." And he reached for more popcorn. After another interval of chewing and belching, the terror of land and sea drew a long knife from his belt and picked at his teeth with the point of a blade. Leaning over towards Hank, he nudged him with the ribs of the handle, winked and growled. "Do you happen to know, lad, where an old sea dog might get himself a spot of rum? Old Teach ain't had so much a drop since I run into that scrovy Bob Naynard over yonder." He gestured with a thumb over his shoulder at the statue. "Ah, back in 1718 it were. Like to have cut his gullet out and ate it too, I did. But the bloody lobster snuck up behind me and done me in, he did." Well, he helped himself to more popcorn. "You looks like to old Teach like a couple of bright lads, and Godolphin town being all growed the way it is, and all. Well, he's got to teach a mite off course to do. Lost his bearings he has. Now speak up, me lads. Where can a body get a spot of rum?" Well, he leaned forward, placing his elbows upon his knees and turning his massive head, looked JD squarely in the face. His brutish features were gradually transformed by a broad smile. "Ah, what be the matter, mateys?
The cat got your tongues.
The beaming smile thawed some of JD's fears, and, well, he almost forgot he was being addressed by a ghost.
You can't buy rum here, sir. This is a dry county.
Teach snapped his torso upright. His cutlass clashed against the bench, and Hank spilled the popcorn.
Dry county, he roared.
Blash me barnacles!
What be a dry county?
His scowling gaze swept up and down the street and the park behind him. Then he reached inside his jacket and scratched his ribs.
You mean just because it don't rain for a spell, a body can't buy some rum?
Well, oh no, sir, JD replied.
I mean, it's against the law to sell liquor in Godolphin County.
Teach slowly settled back on the bench and moved his hat back an inch, and contemplatively scratched his chin beneath his beard.
Now, even that ain't the scroviest kettle of fish. A swab ain't being able to buy himself a spot of rum in Godolphin town.
Well, for a long moment he was deep in thought. Suddenly he leaped to his feet and angrily paced back and forth in front of the cringing boys, scratching his back and growling like a bear. Abruptly he stopped and snapped his fingers.
Mark me, lads. I lay a tuppence that seagoing rum scotch Bob Maynard had a scurvy hand in this. Swog in me eyes if an old teacher ain't gold. Maynard always trying to sink. Good honest seaman he were, and getting right fine wages for it too.
He continued his thoughtful pacing, but finally his face brightened.
Hang me from a tavern tree, mateys. But rain or no rain, honest old Teach knows where there be rum.
His little pig eyes darted from side to side, and he pushed his face close to the boys. Breath reeking of garlic, he croaked secretively out of one side of his mouth.
Me boar's head, where it will be.
Well, he stood erect and grinned, and JD and Hank stared at each other.
Now,
he rumbled.
Fetch me more of the maize, lads.
Well, neither of them stirred.
Lively now, I say. There be a scurvy lobscotter what has got the parched maize.
Well, he studied them as if he were examining two strange dead fish. Well, then he burst into roars of laughter.
Well, shiver me timbers. Aye, it ain't be the first time old Blackbeard scared a body stiff. Never mind ye that, lads. I'll find the belly-robbing sea cook what has the maize myself.
And with that, he sniffed the air and, grinning, hitched up his pants and headed off with a rolling gait towards the source of the popcorn smell. For an instant, both boys hesitated. Then both scrambled to their feet and dashed across the lawn towards the statue of Robert Maynard, throwing themselves flat against the ground behind it, and for several moments they lay gasping, not daring to move.
We can't stay here forever,
JD whispered. Together they slowly rose and peered between the sturdy leg of Blackbeard's worst enemy, back at the bench where they had sat. JD's face was tense.
Can you see him, Hank?
He whispered.
I can't. Where do you suppose he went?
Hank's eyes were round green grapes.
No, he's gone. Right in front of my eyes, he faded out.
Within the popcorn wagon, the vendor was whistling the latest popular tune as he filled a box. He expected a rush of business in about half an hour, and suddenly, well, the box of popcorn was snatched from his hand, vanished, and his whistle died like a tire going out of air. Meanwhile, JD and Hank had crept stealthily from behind the base of the statue and were cautiously skirting a clump of bushes when they were petrified by the sound of Teach's voice, not 10 feet away.
"Oh, me lads,"
he roared. As one, they dived into the bushes, and Teach eyed the moving branches and chuckled.
Have a bit of parched maize, lads."
While under the spreading branches, JD and Hank rammed their bodies into the turf and went rigid.
"Holy cow,"
JD breathed. Between the low-hanging branches, they watched the pirate's booted feet go on tiptoe and steal forward, or where they were laying shaking in terror. Hank's fingers dug into JD's arms, and the boots came to a halt, spread far apart, then began rocking from heel to toe, just 3 feet from their heads. At the terrifying instant, from up the street came the rapid click of high heels on hard pavement, and the boots turned in the direction of that sound. Well, JD couldn't see the pirate's sly, mischievous grin turn into a sickly, sweet smile. As for Hank, well, he couldn't see it either. His head was buried under his arms. The girl approaching was about as pretty a lass as any Blackbeard had ever seen. Well, and he whipped off his hat. As she tripped by, his huge figure jackknifed into an elegant bow. Well, unfortunately, the tribute went unseen, and the girl clicked up the street. Teach indignantly stared after her. Didn't she know who he was? Didn't he have the reputation of being the boldest pirate on land and sea, especially where the fair sex was concerned? Well, just because he was a ghost didn't mean he was going to change. The frown quickly became a grin, and giving his belt a hitch, well, he followed her with his usual rolling gait. He pursued the girl to the corner of Main Street and 2nd Avenue, where he dejectedly watched her run into the arms of a weak-looking man wearing horn-rimmed glasses. Well, this individual, it seemed to Teach, was more interested in something tied to his wrist than he was to the pretty lass. He kept pointing at it and grumbling about how late she was. And with a snort of disgust, the pirate turned from the pair and made his way up Main Street. Well, the busy avenue was alive with strollers enjoying the balmy evening, and Teach became his old gay self again. He chuckled. The town be having a heap more pretty wenches than it used to, he thought, and he rambled along the broad sidewalk, stuffing popcorn into his mouth and bowing low to each girl he passed. But mark ye, well, they be catching the ague for sure, running afore the wind and nothing but a shift. Well, the boys followed him, but at a considerable distance, now and then ducking into a convenient doorway and watching with alarm the progress of this fantastic ghost that only they could see. Well, they saw him sneak up behind a dignified man and, well, flipped his Homburg hat over his eyes. They watched the man whirl around with a grunt of indignation, and heard Blackbeard's roar of laughter at his victim's puzzled consternation. Well, the neon signs particularly caught his fancy. The way they blinked and buzzed and were so bright. Well, he squeezed one of them glowing tubes between his fingers, and he did so often, well, he used to snuff out a candle. Well, the glass crunched, and the entire sign went dark. Blackbeard gaped and gasped, and his jaws hanging in amazement. "Jakers!" he grinned slyly. He tossed away his empty popcorn box and gaped at another. It was a much larger sign than the first, and he found it necessary to climb an adjacent telephone pole to reach it. Well, he gave that blazing red tube a quick squeeze as well. And after that, one by one, every glowing and urgent demand for attention on Main Street went out of business. Outraged shopkeepers stormed, but most of their potential customers remarked about how much nicer the street looked like without all those signs. Well, having finished this exhilarating sport and the unintentional bit of civic improvement, the pirates started to cross the busy thoroughfare in the middle of the block. This, of course, was more dangerous for Blackbeard's type of ghost than it was for a living person because, well, although J.D. and Hank could see him, no one else could. And unlike an ordinary ghost, well, he was solid. Real solid. You couldn't shove your hand through him. He was a poltergeist and had invisible substance. Therefore, Blackbeard had to be careful, especially around cars. But cars, well, there was something he had a lot to learn about. Blithely, he stepped down off the curb and within a second was roaring and skipping about like a wounded banshee, dodging cars that whizzed by him faster than anything he ever dreamed of. Somehow, well, and very luckily, he reached the comparative safety of the middle of the street, losing most of his pride and dignity somewhere on the way. With cutlass drawn, he glared at the insolent speeding demons swooshing by. For an hour he had wandered the streets in search of his old home. And the more he looked, well, the more confused he became. Suddenly, the headlights of a car pulling out of a driveway flooded the boar's head with light. The moving glare marched vertical tree-like shadows across the gray facade. Teach saw it and screeched with joy. Motorists, while mistaking it for the screech of a police siren, skidded their cars to a halt. For a long moment, Blackbeard stared at his pride and joy. Then, as if in a daze, stepped from the curb to the street and followed a zigzag course between the waiting cars towards the old structure. His eyes were shining as he moved faster and faster, his cutlass slapping against his thigh as he stomped and clinked up to the gate. Well, he didn't open the gate, but leaned on the fence, arms wide stretched, the point of the picket clutched in each hand. Abruptly, his grin collapsed. His face darkened to a scowl. A large sign had caught his eye. It was new, and the fresh paint gleamed. Gigantic, crisp, black and red letters stated in this location soon, a new Summit Oil Company gasoline station would be erected. Wildly modern, consisting of an arrangement of sharp straight lines combined with juts and angles that zoomed, curved, and whistled off in every direction. Lines and forms that fulfilled no function except to attract attention. Well, it was as if the building had been frozen in the process of blowing up. On the very bottom of the sign prominently displayed was J.R. Maynard Construction Company. Well, Blackbeard yanked open the gate, and as he passed through, his heels crunched and dug into the gravel path. He stopped in front of the sign, completely bewildered. He shook his head and turned his attention to the boar's head. Now his eyes filled with sadness and dismay. Well, they grew moist and he blinked. Pulling a colorful rag from the side pocket of his coat, he noisily blew his nose. "Did you hear that?" asked a voice from behind him. "Place is haunted, that's for sure." Teach turned his head and an elderly couple were standing on the sidewalk, looking at the boar's head. "Glad they're going to tear down that eyesore," continued the man.
"Why, Albert, it's a shame,"
cried the old woman.
"That's what it is. It ought to be restored. It could be such a pretty place if it..."
I can't do an old woman's voice. Sorry, I'm just going to keep my normal one. "It could be such a pretty place if it was just fixed up a bit. Betty Ryberg was saying the other day that it used to belong to a pirate." "Yep," said the man. "I heard that story too. Don't put much stock in it, but old Sourpuss Maynard sure got a pretty penny for the place. Been in his family for years." "I still think it's a pity," she insisted, "to tear down such a historic relic. All those beautiful trees, too, just to build an ugly gas station. Someone ought to stop them." Well, Blackbeard's face was a thundercloud. He shot a look at the sign, the boar's head, and then back at the couple. They had started up the street, and with one hand, Teach lifted the brim of his hat, scratching his head, watching the figures until they were out of sight. By day, the tap room of the tavern was a dreary place. At night, well, it was 10 times worse. The moving headlights of passing cars stenciled weird moving shapes on the peeling plaster walls, creating a veritable convention hall of banshees, ghosts, goblins, well, and just plain spooks. Street noises were remote, adding to the eerie aspect. Blackbeard entered the tap room, his bulk making the ceiling seem even lower. Grinning his delight, he looked about with a familiar eye. But as he took in the tattered hanging wallpaper, the piles of debris and dust on the floor, and the cluttered stacks of splintered lumber, well, his face was clouded. "Ain't no way old Alditha used to keep the place," he grumbled. Over the windsill peered the wide eyes of J.D. and Hank. They watched the ghost stride to the bar, pound on it with the palm of his hand. "Ho, John!" he bellowed. "Oh, John Clark, you scary old sea-wonk." Courage drained from the boys like a yolk from a broken egg. Teach heard the scrambling of their feet as they dashed from the porch, and he chuckled on as he went to the door and watched them skid around the fence post into Main Street. Still chuckling, he returned to the bar. "Oh, Johnny," he roared again in his deep, rumbling voice. "'Tis the captain at a teach aboard, 'tis, and mighty need of a nip of Cape Horn rainwater.
Been in a dry dock too long, he has.
Well, cocking his massive head to one side, he listened expectantly. But his only answer was the distant blast of a ship's whistle and the raucous tooting of a traffic jam. Lights from the street danced an Indian war dance over his face and on the wall behind him. In the long, dismal hallway he frowned, squinted with his knuckles, vigorously rubbed his nose. Then, giving his belt a hitch, he ambled towards the room at the far end, the floorboards creaking and complaining under his weight. "Hit war somewheres in here," he muttered, and nosed about the room, shoving rubbish and plastered right and left with his booted foot. "Aha!" he chortled. "This be it!" Dropping to his knees, he drew his cutlass, and with the point pried open the corner of a plank, the rusty nails protesting as the board came loose. He tossed this aside and reached down an arm's length into the opening, his cheek flat against the board. His worried look became a grin of triumph when his searching hand found and clutched an old dusty bottle. The captain sat in the middle of a patch of moonlight and yanked the cork. He hoisted the bottle high above his face and grinned. "Here's to ye, Bob Maynard, ye orphan cheating old sea toad. Here's to ye and your scrovy old dry weather drinking laws." Well, JD and Hank scuffled down. Oh, hold on. New chapter. Remember, parched throat, literary juice. Yes, literary juice. What every reader needs. Patent pending. All right, where were we? Oh, yes. Chapter 8. JD and Hank scuffed down Main Street towards the waterfront and a small park that was called Maynard Square, putting distance between themselves and the Boar's Head Tavern. They had discussed every angle of the position they were in, the ghastly phenomenon they had created, as well as possible ways of getting out of the mess. Well, they had come up with nothing, and there was no way out. Both were very much aware how potent this monster could be. JD remembered how cold and solid Blackbeard's sheathed cutlass had felt earlier that evening when it accidentally banged against his leg. Why, this ghost can actually kill someone. Well, he mentioned this to Hank and added, "Well, it's like being Frankenstein and creating a monster." Hank scoffed. "Yeah, but that was only a movie and this is for real." Well, in the park, they carefully avoided the bench upon which they had first met their ghostly pirate friend and chose one close by the popcorn wagon. The street light above spread a comforting light, and the boys felt comparatively safe. They slouched on the bench, feet sprawled out before them, hands stuffed deep in trouser pockets. For a long time they sat in depressed silence, and then Hank said, "Feel like some popcorn, JD?" JD moodily eyed the wagon. "Nah," he grumbled. "I ain't hungry." "I guess I ain't either." "Do you suppose he's gone?" "Who?" "Who?" JD blurted. "Who do you suppose?" "Oh, yeah. Golly, I hope so." Again there was silence, and suddenly JD grabbed Hank's arm. "Hey, did you see that cover move?" "Huh?" That sewer cover, the one near the curb, by the wagon. Did you see it move?" Hank squinted from JD to the cover his friend was pointing at. I didn't see. Hey! Jeepers, it did move." Both scrambled bolt upright. JD's knuckles whitened as his fingers dug into Hank's arm. The cover was jiggling up and down, making hollow sounds. Then it erupted and soared, landing flat on the pavement 10 feet away. It wobbled and clattered like a gigantic silver dollar. The popcorn vendor scrambled out of his wagon, and JD and Hank lingered only long enough to watch a hairy hand clutching a bottle come up out of the sewer and place the precious article on the pavement beside the opening. By the time another hand appeared, followed by a bearded face, well, the boys were well on their way. "Oh, it must have been some kind of gas explosion in the sewer system," the vendor explained to any of the small crowd who would listen. No one saw the real cause or heard him grunt as he climbed out of the sewer. Teach picked up his bottle, hiccuped, and eyed the manhole. Folks got escape hatches all over town," he muttered. "Wonder whom be the rumscutches they be trying to get away from." While noticing the group gathered on the sidewalk, Teach grinned and performed a lavish bow. A bow like this, he exulted as he swept the street with his hat. Would make that scurvy even cleaner than seaweed. Well, as he lurched and rolled up Main Street, these bows became more frequent. He was singing in a deep bass voice, holding the neck of the bottle in one hand and waving his cutlass like a baton in the other. Chanting lustily, he passed within a few feet of the boys, cowered between two parked cars. I still can't figure out, whispered J.D. after he had passed, why nobody can see him and hear him except us. Yeah, replied Hank, his eyes following the boisterous pirate up the street. But like I told you, we never should have fooled around with that magic stuff. You're the kook that said there was no such thing as ghost. Not only that, look at the condition he's in. J.D. knew that it was really his fault, and the mantle of responsibility settled about his soul like a shroud. He remembered the words of the magic scroll, especially the incomplete sentence that read, Let these words, O black magic, bring misery too. Well, and as he peered up the street as the ghost, the shroud became icy cold. Night in the arching branches of the trees had transformed Elm Street into a quiet, deserted green tunnel, lined with houses and gleaming windows that revealed people moving aimlessly about, watching TV or reading newspapers. Bugs and moths flitted, smacked, and batted into the street lamps. A lawn sprinkler lazily revolved. And within this tunnel, J.D. and Hank came to a halt in front of the Jones residence. Well, see you in the morning, Hank. Yeah, see you, replied the tall boy. He started to go, hesitated, and scanned the street in every direction. I sure hope, well, that you know who doesn't show up again. Yeah, me too. Halfway up this porch steps, J.D. stopped and called after Hank, whose long legs were rapidly scissoring him towards his home next door. He was going to ask if it would be all right if he stayed overnight at Hank's house. Yeah? Said Hank, answered from his own porch. Oh, nothing. It wasn't important. And he jogged up the rest of his steps, and the two screen doors banged in rapid succession. Well, in the shadows, Blackbeard leaned his invisible shoulder against the trunk of a tree, crossing his legs and picking at a back tooth with a thumbnail, and chuckled. J.D. entered the living room. Mr. Jones was stretched out with his stocking feet on the chintz-covered sofa near the fireplace. From behind his newspaper, blue clouds of pipe smoke rose and lazily curled about the lamp above his head. Mrs. Jones was knitting, and one completed sleeve hung from her lap to the floor. Above her, on the mantel of the fireplace, stood the large, ornate porcelain vase, which was her pride and joy. She looked up. Oh, J.D., you startled me. I didn't hear you come in. Mr. Jones lowered the newspaper in his lap and removed his pipe from his mouth and said, Well, kind of late to be prowling the streets, isn't it, son? Oh, Dad, it ain't late. Isn't it? Prompted Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones glanced at the monstrous grandfather's clock that stood in the corner. Late enough. There's school tomorrow. And he went back to his paper. Where were you all evening? Mrs. Jones asked. J.D. shot a frightened glance into the darkened entrance hallway. He thought he heard the front door open. He came around slowly. Huh? He said. Mrs. Jones laid down her knitting and studied her son. I asked, where were you all evening? I was with Hank, and we were in the park. Well, different places. The only illumination was provided by two lamps his parents were using, and for the first time J.D. realized how gloomy the room could be. He shuffled about, peering into dark corners, then snapped on a wall switch, flooding the room with light. Turn those lights off, J.D., commanded his father. We have enough light, and if you knew what our light bill is every month. Well, he looked at him closely, and you look pale. Are you feeling sick? J.D. snapped off the lights. I feel all right. Well, stop fidgeting. Have you got all of your homework done? Uh-huh. Well, get a book and read. See? Get a book and read. It's good advice for everyone. On the desk was a book he had started. Well, now he went there, sat, but he couldn't bring himself to read. He strained his eyes, trying to penetrate the gloomy shadows. He remembered how in the park the ghost had mysteriously vanished and then just as quickly reappeared. And now he was almost positive he had heard the front door open. "Mom, can I turn on the TV?" "No." And his mother said his mother without looking up.
"You look at that TV too much as it is. Anyways, disturbed your father."
JD groaned, turned to his book, and tried to concentrate. He picked up a pencil and chewed it. The grandfather's clock clunked off the seconds like a tripping hammer. "Dad?" Said his father in a cloud of smoke above the newspaper. "Dad, have you ever heard of a poltergeist?" "A what?" A poltergeist." The newspaper came down. "A poltergeist?" Mrs. Jones, without stopping her knitting, interrupted.
"Certainly, John. You know what a poltergeist is. Don't you remember Sam Obertuffer telling us about the one in his grandmother's house? It's a ghost. A very stupid kind of ghost. It goes around causing mischief. I think he said this one kept pushing knobs or something off a bed."
"Brass balls," put in JD. "4 of them." Mr. Jones wrapped his ashes from his pipe. "You didn't believe that rubbish, I hope." He put the stem of his dead pipe back between his teeth and disappeared behind the paper.
"I don't know, John. Sam was pretty positive. If it is true, I think it would be rather annoying to have such a horrible creature around."
It's a lot of I need more literary juice. Hold on. It's a lot of an imagination, Alice, so forget it. "But Dad," JD insisted, "there could be..." "Huh?" The pages of the newspaper crackled as Mr. Jones turned them. "Quit talking nonsense, JD, and read your book." "Holy cow, Dad, I've seen..." JD's wide eyes were fixed upon his mother's ornate vase. Under its own power, the vase was inching along the mantelpiece towards certain destruction. "Yeah?" said Mr. Jones absently. "What did you see?" For a long moment, JD was transfixed with terror. He glanced at his parents. They were totally unaware of the impending disaster. "Huh?" said Mr. Jones. "Oh, nothing," JD mumbled as he cautiously rose from his seat and edged towards the fireplace. The vase was teetering on the brink, and as it went over, JD caught it like a football. The urn went crazing in his arms. It jerked about, trying to escape. Mrs. Jones looked up in alarm, and words choked from her throat.
"JD, you put that vase down! What in the world is the matter with you?"
Instantly, the ceramic acrobatics quit, and the urn once more behaved like an honest Sheboygan work of art.
"Put it back," she ordered. "Put it back right now before you break it. Why, I can't understand whatever's gotten into you."
JD gingerly placed it on the ledge, cautiously withdrawing his hands, but ready to grab it the instant it moved. It was so close to the edge, Mom. He backed away, still keeping an eye on the precious vase. Mrs. Jones tightened her lips, shook her head, and picked up her knitting.
"It was perfectly all right where it was. And JD, I appreciate your consideration, but good heavens, did you have to bounce it around like that? Why, you frightened me so."
JD hung his head and flopped down into his chair at the desk. He gave the rug a disgusted scuff with his foot and turned a pleading look towards his mother. "Mom, if you only..." He looked fearfully around the room and then back at his mother. "Mom, it's ghost business. He looked at the sweater. His body stiffened, and he clutched the arm of the old swivel chair so tightly his finger ached. On the verge of panic, he suddenly breathed, "Oh no!" The sleeve of the sweater, starting at the cuff, was slowly unraveling. The thread of the yarn stretched taut across the floor around the base of the desk, then across the room, disappearing around the corner into the dark recess of the hall. On and on the diabolical destruction. 1/4 of the sleeve was already gone, and from the hallway came a low snicker. Mrs. Jones glanced up at her husband.
"Did you hear a noise, John?" I thought I heard someone chuckle. Did you hear anything, JD?
JD's foot was blindly trying to find and pin down the thread of yarn, and at the same time he was making a great show of concentration on his book. Actually, the activity had been so completely absorbing that he hadn't heard the snicker. Huh? He grunted.
I asked,
Repeated Mrs. Jones.
whether you heard the sound of a chuckle.
Mrs. Jones said, and went back to her knitting. And JD's foot found the cord. He felt it jerk angrily as he pinned it to the floor. His posture, however, was both ludicrous and uncomfortable. And when he spoke, his voice was plaintive and high-pitched. Dad! Now what?
I'm sure there must be such a thing as a ghost. Today
The newspaper crunched down on his father's lap, and over his glasses, Mr. Jones impatiently glared at his son. I tell you, this stuff about ghosts is nonsense. And I've been getting around here lately is talk about ghosts. Let's drop it, huh? And at that moment, the jerking string of yarn escaped, and the unraveling resumed at an even more rapid pace. JD heard a deep chuckle of glee from the hall, and he glanced at his parents, almost hoping they had heard it too, but apparently they hadn't, because Mrs. Jones merely put her knitting down and looked calmly at her husband.
Now, John,
she said thoughtfully,
I wouldn't be too sure. There have been dozens of stories about that old house that Maynard owns. Blackbeard the pirate used to live there.
Dad laughed. Okay, have it your way. But if Blackbeard's ghost is hanging out in an old shack, he'd better do some house hunting instead of house haunting. And there's going to tear that mess down. Mrs. Jones picked up her knitting.
Yes, I know, it's a pity. It should be preserved.
The unraveling hesitated.
Why, I think,
She continued.
that house is really a lovely place. All it needs is a coat of paint. And to think,
She paused in her knitting and dreamily added,
that Blackbeard, the most daring and exciting pirate who ever lived, was supposed to have built that house.
Well, the destruction of the sleeve came to a complete halt. The astonished boy watched the process reverse itself. The sleeve, as if by magic, was being reknit, and in a twinkling it was whole once more. Blackbeard, darling? Huh, scoffed Mr. Jones. Why, he was nothing but an old fake, a bag of wind. Used to fix up his whiskers with fuses or something. Then he'd light them to make himself look all fierce and trying to scare people. Well, Joe Maynard told me about him. J.D. stared at his father in alarm and sped a glance towards the hallway. But Dad, he whined, expecting any second to see his father go up in a cloud of smoke. Dad? Mr. Jones ignored him and turned his attention back to the paper and added, well, if that old fake is haunting any place, there's nothing to worry about that. Wham! The newspaper in his father's hand was batted to the ceiling, and the loose pages floated down the startling head of Mr. Jones. Dazed, he slowly sat up and gaped in wonder at the torn pieces remaining in his hand. I tell you, Sam, cried Mr. Jones in the telephone, it was the darndest thing. Night, Dad, said J.D. as he edged his way up to his room. Dad nodded and moved to one side. Yeah, batted right out of my hand. Sure, I remember, your grandmother's house. J.D. moved slowly up the stairs, first because he wasn't eager to be alone in his room with Blackbeard in the house. Well, second, he wanted to hear what his father had to say to Hank's father. At the top of the stairs, he waited and listened. Same thing, huh? Said Mr. Jones. I never would have believed it. Yeah, took a big loss, eh? Well, I hope this thing doesn't drive us out of our place. Holy cow, thought J.D. What if our house got the reputation of being haunted? What if Blackbeard set it on fire? He took the first hesitant steps in the direction of his room. What if Dad kept on insulting Blackbeard? At the end of the hall where JD's room was, it was high-pitched black, and it took a lot of courage to get there. He turned the knob as if it were a stick of dynamite, opened the door, and quickly crossed the darkened room to his dresser, upon which rested a small lamp. As he fumbled under the shade for the switch, his left hand came in contact with something cold, lying on the dresser. It was hard and carved. Delicately, his fingers traveled along the surface until, with a shock of realization, he felt the hilt. It was Captain Teach's cutlass. He snapped on the light. Fearfully, J.D. raised his eyes from the cutlass to the large mirror above the dresser. He could see how white his face was, and his eyes traveled from one side of the mirror to the other, and he heaved a sigh of relief. If I can see his sword, I should be able to see him. Maybe he isn't really here. Maybe he went over to Hank's. Those were his thoughts as he studied his reflection in the mirror. To his right was a lumpy, overstuffed armchair. Behind it, the bookcases, and on the walls, his pennants and pictures. Everything was in his place and no Blackbeard. Relieved, J.D. turned away from the mirror, only to suck in a startled Invisible in the mirror, but plainly visible to J.D.'s eyes, the ghost of Captain Teach lounged deep within the cozy confines of his easy chair, booted feet spread wide. His coat collar was bunched high about his neck and his hat pulled low over his forehead, filling all the space between his bushy black beard. All J.D. could see that resembled a face were two uneven rows of grinning yellow teeth and one amused glowing eye. Blackbeard's arms hung limply over the sides of the chair, while one hand was loosely holding a bottle of rum. J.D. leaped for the door, and his hand was on the knob when he heard the deep voice rumble. "Hold on, me bucko." J.D. froze. "Come in and set." Something about the voice was both reassuring and disarming. J.D. taking a deep breath, J.D. turned and faced the pirate. Well, Teach was smiling broadly. Ghost or no ghost, thought J.D. Well, he doesn't look or act like one. But why is it that sometimes people can hear him, then other times not? And why is it only Hank and I can see him? Well, and then only part of the time. J.D.'s conception of a ghost was a skeleton wrapped in a sheet, who went about dragging trains and moaning. Well, Blackbeard didn't fit that description at all. No sense in fearing good old honest Captain Teach. Set yourself down, lad. He spoke as if the room belonged to him. J.D. backed towards his bed and sat as far from Teach as he could, his eyes moving and wander from Teach to the mirror and then back at Teach again. The burly pirate pushed his hat back on his head, scowled, and waved the bottle in the direction of the mirror. Oh, that blasted looking glass won't work for me nohow. Bloody shame 'tis. He put the bottle back to his lips, raised it high, and it gurgled. Then, making a wry face, he wiped his mouth on his sleeve. Oh, Teach ain't seen himself in years. For a while he was silent, and J.D. fidgeted nervously. Then Blackbeard held the bottle to the light, squinted it with one eye, turned it upside down, and convinced it was empty. Placed it with a long sigh on the floor beside his chair. This here town, he complained, ain't what it used to be. Well, but it'd be a whole heap better than what it was. There was another silence, and this time much longer, during which he warily studied J.D. The boy felt as though he was some kind of specimen under a microscope of a madman on a TV thriller. Finally, Teach spoke. Ah, when are you fixing to send me back, lad? You know, I be overstaying my leave. If I be late getting back, old Teach can get into a peck of trouble with the red swab down there. He pumped his big thumb at the floor. Horns like a bloody cow he has. You're planning to send Teach back now, aren't you? J.D. heard himself speak in a voice that seemed miles away. That's just it, sir. I don't know how to send you back. With an incredulous stare, Teach rose from the chair and paced the floor. He thought thoughtfully. Now that'd be a pretty kettle of fish. But I say now, lad, don't let it worry ye none. Me being docked close by the Boar's Head and all. He again pointed at the door. But, by all the bones in Davy's locker, if I don't ever get back. His laugh was a roar, and he used his dirty handkerchief to wipe the tears of mirth from his eyes. At any moment, minute, JD expected to hear his parents' rapid footsteps. He was positive that not only, but everyone in the block must have had heard that explosive laughter. He eyed the door and waited. Blackbeard stuffed the rag back into his pocket.
"You're sure now, lad?"
he said, spurring a thick finger at JD.
"You be sure for starting you don't know how to send a body back."
Cross my heart, Captain Teach.
The pirate turned away from JD and with his hands clasped behind his back crossed to the window and studied the Joneses' yard. He spoke over his shoulder, spacing his words carefully and slyly.
"And effing you could send me back. What then, lad? What then?"
Oh, no, sir. No. I'll only do what you want me to, sir.
Blackbeard heaved a great rumbling sigh of satisfaction and grin of triumph spread over his feature.
"Well now, JD, lad, that be just fine, I say, and I takes it right hearty what ye did for old Teach. I does mark ye from this day on, old Teach and JD, well, ship's mates we are."
He moved his huge, ungainly frame to the dresser, scowled into the mirror, and then turned a mournful face to JD. He looked like a sheepdog who had just lost his sheep.
"But a blinking shame, 'tis. Captain Teach ashore, and nary a swab can see him, except you and Hank, that is."
Turning to the mirror again, he peered into it regretfully.
"And when ye figures all them poor, unlucky wenches what can't see old Teach, well, it sure battens down me hatches, it do."
Well, shuffling to the chair, he sank heavily into it. JD actually felt sorry for him.
"Cheapers,"
he said.
"Oh, I'm sorry, Captain. Well, we could try it again, maybe this time."
Teach exploded.
"Try again? Not on your life, lad. You'd have me back down there before you could say Old Bailey."
The pirate sat and pondered. At last he raised his chin from two ham-like fists that supported it and asked with a note of suspicion in his voice.
"Who were the witch, lad? Who were the witch whose ashes ye used to write the magic marks in?"
"Ashes?" JD exclaimed. I didn't use ashes, I used flour."
Teach sat erect.
"Flour?"
he gasped.
"Ye mean the stuff ye bake breads with?"
"Yes, sir."
With a small whimper, Blackbeard fell weakly back into the chair.
"God blimey,"
he said to the ceiling.
"He used flour."
His beard came down upon his chest, incredulous and amazed, he asked.
"Didn't ye know, lad? You're supposed to use the ashes of a witch new burned at the stake."
JD studied and picked up at his fingernail. "No, sir," he mumbled.
"So that be why the wenches don't have the pleasure of seeing old Teach. Well, I have to split a tops else ye lads wouldn't see me neither."
He got up and clasped his hands behind his back and paced the room again.
"Effin' you couldn't get a witch. Why in thunder didn't you get the ashes of a couple of toads, or a snake or two? I mean, burned ye at the dark o' moon, of course."
He stopped pacing and scratched his head.
"Nope, wouldn't have worked neither. For the wenches, well, you be needing a real witch."
His brow furrowed in deep thought, and he wheeled to face JD.
"Ye wouldn't be knowing the whereabouts of a real live witch now, would you, lads? You know, we could."
The thought horrified JD. "Oh, no, sir!" Teach hopelessly synchronized the shaking of his head with JD's.
"No witches, huh?"
He turned away, then back again, his little finger digging into the hairy air.
"Are you sure there ain't a live witch in Godolphin town?"
JD nodded vigorously.
"Yes, sir, I'm sure."
Teach frowned.
How in blazes can a town get along without a witch?
He muttered, easing himself into a heavy chair.
What do a body do if a body catches the gout, or the ague, or boil even? What be these bilge, lad, about tearing down me boar's head?
Well, they're going to build a gas station, sir.
A gas station?
Yes, sir.
Tell me, lad, what be a bloomin' gas station?
Well, it's a place where people buy gas and oil and stuff for their cars.
You mean to feed them grunting wagons that go by themselves, till a horse pull them?
Yes, sir.
The pirate's beard bristled and was scowled in unbelievable scorn.
And for that, they be fixin' to scuttle the finest tap room in the colonies?
Well, yes, sir, I guess so.
Blackbeard wiped his nose on his sleeve.
Aye. They must be daft. Who, lad, who be the swab who thinks he owns me Boar's Head Tavern?
Well, J.D. answered hesitantly.
Mr. Maynard, sir?
It was as though Teach had been shot out of a cannon. J.D. went flat on his back across the studio couch and scrambled into the corner. The pirate grabbed his cutlass from the dresser and stalked to the bed.
Be ye starting a scurvy swab's Maynard?
He thundered. J.D.'s jaw worked.
Speak up, lad, speak up. Be the wonk's name Maynard?
Yes, sir.
Why, that scurvy bit of lead swinging goppus owns me board head, do he? Why, I fit gaiters with me bare hands, I did. Chawed the living gizzard out of any swab who stood agin me. I were murdering gouging sea shark, I were.
Then, to J.D.'s surprise, he abruptly turned his back on the boy and bowed his head in shame and disgust.
And what happens? I get myself scuttered by that lily-livered shrimp Maynard.
When Teach again faced J.D., the boy started to see actual tears in his eyes. And when he spoke, it was with mingled hurt and indignation.
Stabbed me in the back, he did. Stabbed me in the back. Done me in just when kind and gentle old Teach were feeding victuals to some poor starving orphans.
He walked slowly to the dresser, put down his cutlass and removed his handkerchief and blew his nose. Then he went to the window and looked up at the sky and sniffed once or twice. Looking over his shoulder at J.D., he assumed a wheedling tone.
But do you suppose, J.D., that this be the same sly, thieving, backstabbing Maynard what done in friendly old Teach? The Maynard what done me in was a big, strong fella about yea high.
He held his hand a foot above his head. J.D. answered quickly, relieving that Teach was himself again.
Oh, no, sir,
he said with emphasis.
This is a different Mr. Maynard. Pop Allen, our history teacher, well, who knows all about pirates and stuff, says this Mr. Maynard is a descendant or something. He says this Mr. Maynard is a worse robber than,
Teach's eyes were cold as he came around, and the boy, after a few hard swallows, continued.
Well, the old Captain Maynard got the boar's head from Governor Eden for killing, well, it's been in the family ever since. Sir.
Blackbeard scowled in disbelief.
Ye be telling Teach that lump o' hog-blubbered Eden gave me boar's head to Maynard for doing me in?
J.D. cringed and in horror watched the pirate pull an ugly knife from his belt.
I be coming for ye, Eden,
he snarled. Halfway across the room he paused, screwed up his face and scratched his cheek.
Blast, Eden! Can't be hurting a ghost.
He turned helplessly to J.D., who wondered at the reason for the sudden change.
This Maynard fellow,
Teach queried.
He be no Maynard's blood, he is. Big feller too, I reckon.
Well, J.D. nodded and Teach shoved his knife back into his belt.
Aye, lad. Mayhap we better sleep on it. 'Twill be time enough now and the morrow to careen Maynard's scurvy hulk.
Well, yawning, he removed his pistols, knife, and belt, placed them on the dresser beside the cutlass, and removed his jacket. Scratching his back, Teach looked around the room for a place to hang his coat. On the door was a hook and a clothes hanger. He took the hanger down and with a puzzled look, inspected it carefully before tossing it aside and hanging the coat on the hook. Next, he shuffled to the dresser, scratching his ribs, picked up a pistol and his cutlass, turned to the bed, sat down and kicked off his boots. J.D. stared in astonishment and quickly left the entire bed to the pirate, who stretched out, put a pistol in one hand, cutlass in the other. He squinted at the priming of his pistol and said,
Never can tell about that Maynard swab.
Yawning, he pointed to the window with his cutlass.
Batten down ye hatches, lads, secure the ports. Night be air and mighty unhealthful.
Then, crossing the hairy arms upon his chest, a weapon in each hand, he closed his eyes and seemingly began to snore. The Joneses' back screen door creaked a rusty sound as it was carefully opened and closed, and a wash of moonlight revealed J.D. descending the steps to the backyard. Above him, a shutter moved in a slow, easy arc, and thumped against the wall and was still. J.D. hesitated and threw a quick glance upward. Then he hurried down the steps, crossing the moving patch of moonlight, and vaulted the low fence that divided the Jones and Obertuffer properties. Stumbling over a toy wagon, ducking under the branches of an apple tree, he crouched like a hunted jackal below Hank's first-floor bedroom window. He darted a look up at his own window. The shuttered waver, undecided. Selecting a few small pebbles, he tossed them against the screen of Hank's open window. And Butch barked. It seemed like an age before Hank's groggy face appeared between the curtains and his fist rubbing a sleepy eye.
Hey,
said Hank into the night.
What's up?
It's me, J.D. He's in my room.
Who's in your room? Who else? The ghost.
Hank forced his eyes upward toward J.D.'s windows.
Oh my gosh,
he breathed. J.D. rose to his feet.
Let me in, will you? I'm not staying in that house tonight. Sure, go around the back door.
In Hank's room, shoulder to shoulder, the two boys peered at the upstairs window. Black tree shadows writhed upon the clapboards. The loose shutter slammed a few times to attract attention, and then waved like a beckoning hand. The fur on Butch's back bristled. He growled once, and then with tail between his legs crept under the bed. J.D. grabbed Hank's arms. Hank, he gasped. What will we do? And we are going to have to wait to find out what's going to happen next, all right? So that was part 2. Hopefully you enjoyed it, all right? So now, as we've mentioned before, one thing that's really important about chapter books is you need a good bookmark, which I have lost my bookmark. All right, I found it. Hold on. All right, so on Wednesday, 4 p.m. Pacific time, we are going to read part 3, the final part of this book. So we are going to get to the conclusion of Blackbeard's Ghost by Ben Stahl. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. It will be posted later on. Please feel free to share it amongst yourselves. If you haven't already, go back, watch the prologue, watch part 1, come back to part 2, and then we will read the final part 3 on Wednesday. Until then, have safe travels, everyone. Stay in your homes, wash your hands, and enjoy your literary juice. Until next time.